If people didn't know what he was doing, it wasn't worth doing. That was Big Meech's mantra from the time he was a kid, back when he was moving weight around the block, long before it grew into a $270 million empire. Which is why when 2 federal agents walked him out of his $5 million Dallas home and wrapped cuffs around his wrists, something finally clicked. Maybe people didn't have to know. As the agent stood beside him and said his name, Meech realized this wasn't just about him. This was bigger, because at that exact same moment, doors were being kicked in across the country. In Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, St. Louis, familiar names are being taken into custody at the same time. More than 100 people connected to the same organization, the Black Mafia family, were either already in handcuffs or about to be. It was the end of something that's already been taken apart. However, for a long time, surviving felt like proof that despite people knowing what he was doing, the system didn't care. He rolled with Jay, rolled with Diddy, and thought that visibility was protection. It was proof that an illegal $270 million operation could live in plain sight and still move untouched. But standing there in cuffs, that belief finally runs out. And to understand how it ever felt possible, how someone could build that kind of empire, live alongside celebrities, and believe the fall would never come, you have to go back to 80s Detroit, a city that taught him surviving meant winning. The city was in economic freefall. The auto jobs that defined the city began to vanish. And just like the whites were becoming harder to find, so was food. In that environment, kids learned quickly which paths led somewhere and which ones stalled out. Meech wasn't slow. He watched how men in his neighborhood moved. Those who stayed solvent and those who didn't. Those who talked about money and who actually had it. And more importantly, who didn't panic. So they did what a lot of kids in that position did. They adapted. First, they started selling a little weed, just enough to keep the lights on, enough to help their mother breathe. Then they contributed a little to the crack epidemic, selling $50 packs of crack cocaine. As their business grew, so did their clout. That was when they crossed paths with E.D. Boyd. Boyd ran a crew and was already established by the time the Flannery brothers entered the picture. Detroit during the crack era rewarded people who moved early and moved efficiently, and Boyd had done both. Through him, Meech and Terry saw what scale actually looked like. Immediately, Boyd could sense the potential in the boys. Meech stood out because he kept showing up anyway, leaning on the edge of his territory, always acknowledging Boyd when he drove past, always making sure his face became familiar. Eventually, Meech was able to send a message through Boyd's nephew, Kilo, that he wanted an introduction, but Boyd rejected the introduction in the beginning. He let the kid wait, let him sit with the idea that access wasn't automatic. When they finally spoke, Meech didn't try to impress him. He listened. When Boyd talked, Meech absorbed. When Boyd explained the structure, Meech repeated it back with adjustments. That's when Boyd realized something important. This kid wasn't trying to be a worker. He was trying to understand how bosses think. Meech was around 14 or 15 when Boyd put him down with product for the first time. And even if he had been pushing way younger, he didn't know the game yet. He didn't know how to use a triple beam scale properly. He didn't know how to count money correctly. He didn't understand pace, discipline, or how quickly attention could kill momentum. But what he did have was appetite. The work moved so fast that Meech came back asking permission to bring in his people. First Derek Meeks, then his younger brother, Terry Flannery. Boyd agreed, but on one condition that matters later. They were Meech's responsibility. If something went wrong, it came back to him. That's how the 50 Boys actually formed. Boyd designed the system. Meech executed it. At this point, they started pushing big boy deals with $50 minimum buys only. If you came to that corner, you came correct. Customers started asking for them by name because the product was consistent. But while Meech stayed humble to the streets, he was flamboyant. One day, Boyd had taken the boys to Northland Mall and bought them mink coats as a reward. But Meech was moving recklessly. A few days later, Boyd sees them back on the block. Meech has mink coats on, chains out, running the trap. Immediately he pulled up, blew the horn, and Meech already knew. Boyd made him take it off right there. Now, the point of this story is not to say that fur was dangerous, but in Detroit, where people were losing jobs and ending up on the streets, you did not want to stand out. Boyd told Meech not to act like he was new to money, not to make himself hot for no reason. But that kind of advice only lands on someone who didn't want to be seen, and Meech always wanted to be seen. You couldn't take that out of him. If people didn't know what he was doing, it wasn't worth doing. Terry, his younger brother, aka Southwest T, was different. He had to be taught the street side more deliberately. He was quieter, still in school, less interested in shine, more interested in understanding how things worked. Where Meech moved on instinct and confidence, Terry moved on calculation. That difference mattered, because as the money increased, so did the tension between visibility and control. And there was another moment that summed it up. The boys were eating at Stanley's, a Chinese restaurant on 8 Mile and Woodward. Jewelry out, voices up, energy spilling past the booth. Another crew was sitting nearby, listening, clocking everything. Then when they went outside, Meech got shot in the neck. That was cause and effect. When you shine too early, someone always wants to test it. The same thing that made him magnetic was the same thing that would eventually expose him. And yet, Meech didn't retreat. He survived that. Then they survived again later. Each time, the lesson wasn't caution, it was confirmation that he could take hits and keep moving. When Meech and Terry eventually came to Boyd and said they wanted to move weight on their own, not under him, but beside the game, Boyd wasn't surprised. He trained them to be bosses. He knew that day was coming. He gave them his blessing. What Boyd didn't give them and couldn't was restraint. That part had to be learned the hard way. And Detroit was done teaching. Detroit wasn't just violent, it was instructional. Every crew that flamed out did so for reasons you could study. Too reckless, too visible, too emotional, too local. Meech and Terry didn't miss those patterns. By the early 1990s, they were doing something to separate them from most of the people around them. They were thinking. They didn't want corners. Corners created enemies. They didn't want wars. Wars attracted attention. They wanted movement. That's where the first real shift happened. Instead of planting themselves deep in one neighborhood, they started looking outward. Detroit stayed home base, but it stopped being the whole map. The product could move without the name being attached to every block it touched. Money could travel back quietly. As their operation grew, so did friction. Beef with other dealers came with the territory, and one of those conflicts nearly ended everything early. Rival dealer with real weight and territory, Layden Simon, allegedly tried to have Meech killed in a drive-by, all because of his loud mouth. According to Layden, Meech was building his name off situations involving Layden and Layden's late brother, sometimes in ways that sounded like he was using Layden's name to boost his own reputation. In Detroit, that kind of talk isn't ignored. It's interpreted as positioning. Layden's brother had been killed months earlier, so Layden wasn't exactly in the right state of mind. And when Meech kept bringing Layden's brother's name into conversations, it crossed from irritation into disrespect. A sit-down was planned, but nothing came of it. And in Detroit, once a sit-down fails, everything after it is understood. Not long after, Layden found out his nephew had been beaten to death. That changed the temperature completely. Grief turned personal, patience ran out, and the idea that Meech was still moving loudly in Layden's space felt intentional. The night it finally cracked was in May 1987 at a Coney Island on Detroit's west side. LaDon lived nearby, and Meech knew that, but still decided to host a party. That's what made it more disrespectful. Layden went home and came back armed to meet Meech, sitting inside a Jeep and let fly. Meech was hit in the neck and his stomach, but luckily, he lived. That moment mattered more than the wound, because in the street, surviving a hit like that changes how people read you and how you read yourself. Meech's movement started to feel louder after that, like surviving the shooting validated something instead of warning him. But not long after that, Meech left. By 1989, he was gone from Detroit, setting up shop in Atlanta. Atlanta offered space, distance, new players who didn't know the old beef, a place where survival could be reinterpreted as momentum instead of warning. Cash spoke before threats ever needed to. Terry stayed closer to Detroit, focused on operations and logistics, while Meech handled relationships and expansion. Terry handled structure and discipline. That balance is what allowed the Black Mafia family to grow without collapsing early. By the time Big Meech started thinking beyond Detroit, the problem wasn't ambition, it was reliability. Street connections were emotional. They disappeared when people got scared, greedy, or arrested. One drought could stall everything. One robbery could trigger retaliation. That kind of instability was manageable when you were local. It was fatal if you were trying to move nationally. This was the moment when BMF stopped thinking like dealers and started thinking like infrastructure. Meech and Terry Flannery tapped into Detroit's underground elite the same way everyone else did. Nightlife, soul night at the Fox Theater, after-hours gambling spots disguised as produce markets, places where nobody introduced themselves but everyone noticed who had access and who didn't need permission. That's where they met Harold H. Mills, a supplier who didn't advertise and didn't chase customers. Business with him wasn't frantic, it was scheduled. Weight showed up when it was supposed to, and money went back the same way. That rhythm mattered more than loyalty, but even that ceiling was low. Detroit supply still lived too close to the street. The real shift came with a man known as Bolo. Bolo controlled territory in Mexican Town and had access that went beyond Detroit. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't need to prove anything. When he got arrested and then walked out of Wayne County Jail through the back door, Meech and Terry understood immediately what they were dealing with. BMF backed Bolo financially after his escape as investment. When Bolo fled to Mexico, Meech followed to see how the operation actually lived. They stayed for months in fortified compounds with high walls and controlled movement. Nobody came and went casually. That's where BMF saw the difference between street power and cartel power. Cartels didn't react, they planned. So when BMF started moving cocaine on consignment, 20 kilos at a time, paid per kilo after distribution, they planned it. It was trust being tested. Cartels don't front weight to people they don't expect to survive. The weight moved fast. Within a short span, those 20-kilo shipments multiplied. Hundreds followed. Eventually, they were pushing over 1,000 kilos before supply tightened again. The point wasn't the number, it was the structure that allowed it. From Mexico, the product moved north through Texas, from Texas to Los Angeles, from Los Angeles to Atlanta, from Atlanta outward to every major urban market that mattered. T positioned himself close to the intake points, watching the numbers, monitoring the flow. He didn't like planes. He didn't like the distance from the product. He trusted paper, inventory, and proximity. Meech stayed where influence mattered more than logistics. This was no longer a drug ring. It was a distribution. In Los Angeles, they partnered with Colombian intermediaries like Mondo, people who didn't ask where the product originated, only whether it moved clean. By the late 1990s, BMF had become what was described as Costco for cocaine. Think of them as wholesalers who supplied entire regions. Others took the risk of retail. BMF collected consistency, and money laundering followed the same logic. Jewelry, cash businesses, lottery tickets, anything that could convert bulk cash into plausible revenue streams. They bribed people too, officials with bills to pay, investigators who are willing to trade information for stability, the kind of corruption that doesn't announce itself. But even while all of this was going on, they weren't reckless. Violence wasn't policy, it was a liability. That distinction matters because it explains the fatal contradiction at the heart of Big Meech. The same system that let BMF operate quietly depended on invisibility. And Meech didn't believe in invisibility. By the early 2000s, the money was no longer the point. The system was already perfected by then. Product moved from the southwest border to Atlanta, from Atlanta to satellite cities, and from there into neighborhoods that never saw the supply chain, only the residue. Couriers didn't know suppliers. Street crews didn't know transporters. Money came back up the same way it went out, quiet, layered, predictable. On paper, it was one of the cleanest operations federal agents had ever mapped, but Demetrius Flannery didn't want clean. And again, if people didn't know what you were doing, it wasn't worth doing. And they sure noticed BMF with a large black sign, clean font, white lettering, no street slang, no threats. Just 3 letters that meant nothing to outsiders and everything to people inside the life. BMF. The world's BMF. There was no address, no phone number, no explanation. That was the point. In a world where drug organizations survived by erasing themselves, Meech introduced branding. The signboard announced their existence. It told everyone watching that something organized, funded, and protected this space. It also dared anyone who noticed to ask questions they couldn't safely answer. From there, the logic expanded naturally into nightlife. Atlanta was the perfect city for what Meech wanted next. It was a hub, not a destination. Artists passed through, athletes passed through, Hustlers passed through. The clubs were crossroads, and crossroads were where reputations were made. BMF Entertainment became a laundering mechanism in the traditional sense. Meech and T were already known to associate with numerous high-profile hip-hop artists, including Sean Combs, Trina, T.I., Jay-Z, Young Jeezy, and Fabulous. According to people around the operation, including Boyd, the music division was real events that were paid for, artists were managed, and appearances were booked. The problem was scale. The money backing it didn't match the output. No hit records were generating the kind of capital that BMF spent nightly. Lloyd Da Vinci was the only artist formally signed to BMF Entertainment. He had visibility, features, videos, club performances, and industry access, but he never sold at a level remotely capable of explaining BMF's money. He had no platinum albums, no chart-dominating single, and tour revenue anywhere near 8 figures. Meanwhile, Meech started being sloppy. When Big Meech showed up, they didn't blend in. They arrived early, dressed deliberately, and controlled space. Sections disappeared, bottles multiplied, staff adjusted their behavior without being asked. Meech leaned into that image harder than anyone around him thought was wise. Southwest T saw the danger immediately. He'd always been the quieter of the two, the one focused on infrastructure instead of attention. Boyd describes Terry as disciplined, internal, methodical, someone who understood that survival depended on how little the outside world knew. To Terry, music was unnecessary exposure. To Meech, it was a legacy. From a street perspective, this made sense. Visibility protected you. People hesitated when they knew who you were connected to. From a federal perspective, it was catastrophic. Every event created records, every appearance created witnesses, every photo collapsed the distance between people who were supposed to remain abstract. Like we've continuously established throughout this video, if nobody knew what you were doing, it didn't count. It wasn't ego in the shallow sense. It was something closer to authorship. He didn't want to just win. He wanted proof that he had won, and that would become his undoing. The first real crack didn't come from the top. It came from the middle, exactly where organizations like BMF are most vulnerable. In mid-September 2004, federal investigators wiretapped Raphael Smurf Allison, a low-level Atlanta crack dealer who wasn't important enough to be careful. That wiretap was supposed to be small. Instead, it led them to DeCarlo Hoskins. And as fortune would have it for the cops, Hoskins knew the right people. During monitored conversations, Hoskins told investigators something that immediately escalated the case. He had grown up with 2 brothers, Omari McCree and Jeffrey Layar, who could supply multi-kilogram quantities of cocaine on demand. That sentence changed everything. Wiretap shifted from street-level chatter to organizational mapping. Calls between Hoskins, McCree, and Layar were intercepted. Patterns emerged. And what agents learned was critical. Omari McCree was a high-level distributor directly favored by Demetrius Big Meech Flannery. That's when BMF entered the scope. On November 5th, 2004, those wiretaps paid off. Jeffrey Layar was pulled over on Interstate 75 in Atlanta, driving with his girlfriend. In the back seat, a duffel bag containing 10 kilograms of cocaine. And here's the part most stories gloss over. Layar was released the same day. HIDTA wasn't interested in a single seizure. They wanted the network. Letting Layar go allowed them to keep listening to hear the panic, the damage control, the calls up the chain. Those calls were devastating. McCree and Layar now owed BMF for the lost cocaine. Facing that debt and knowing what failure meant inside an organization like BMF, they went on the run. That alone told investigators everything they needed to know about hierarchy and enforcement. When one of them was finally picked up on June 8th, 2005, the dam broke. A confidential source agreement was signed, roles were explained, supply chains were mapped. Demetrius Flannery was named directly as the source of cocaine, with Chad J-Bo Brown identified as a key supplier acting on Meech's behalf. From that point on, the government didn't have theories, they had confirmation. At the same time, another pillar fell. Earlier, on April 11th, 2004, a BMF courier, Jabari Hayes, had been stopped in Phelps County, Missouri, along Interstate 44, allegedly for swerving over the fog line. Officers were able to seize 95 kilograms of cocaine hidden in luggage tied to a convoy that included a luxury vehicle. That seizure validated the scale. Now, federal agents could credibly claim what they would later put in court filings. BMF was moving hundreds of kilograms at a time every 10 days through stash houses across Atlanta. By October 2005, the case was no longer quiet. The DEA executed coordinated raids, arresting 30 BMF members in one sweep. They seized millions in cash, weapons, vehicles, and enough narcotics to justify what would become one of the most aggressive continuing criminal enterprise prosecutions of the decade. Before those raids even happened, agents had already seized 632 kilograms of cocaine, $5.3 million in cash, and $5.7 million in assets. And they weren't done. When indictments expanded in 2006, the scope of the enterprise became undeniable. Jacob Arabo, Jacob the jeweler, was charged with laundering more than $270 million, tying celebrity culture directly into the financial skeleton of the organization. By trial, the government didn't need to speculate about how BMF worked. They laid it out clinically. 5 stash houses in Atlanta, shipments of 150 kilograms every 10 days, vehicles loaded with cocaine one way, cash the other, bundles counted in $5,000 stacks, prices fixed at $20,000 per kilogram, money sent back to Mexican suppliers through couriers and financial laundering schemes. And when the government needed a voice to narrate what paper couldn't, they leaned on William Doc Marshall, the star witness who tied people to places, faces to product, and stories to evidence. By then, it was already over. When the indictments were unsealed, there was no confusion about what the government intended to do. The government charged them as both traffickers and architects. They used the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, the same law designed to dismantle cartel leadership. That charge alone carried mandatory decades. But the prosecution had to prove that BMF functioned as a sustained hierarchical organization where orders flowed downward and profits flowed up. The indictment stacked everything on top of that foundation: conspiracy to distribute 5 kilograms or more of cocaine, possession with intent to distribute, conspiracy to launder monetary instruments, multiple counts tied to specific seizures and transactions. By design, it left no room to maneuver. Meech was arrested in September 2005, found inside a large home outside Dallas, Texas, far from Detroit, far from Atlanta, but not far enough. Inside the house, agents recovered only small amounts of drugs. That detail mattered. It reinforced what prosecutors had been saying all along. Meech wasn't a street dealer anymore. He was management. T was arrested separately in St. Louis, where weapons were found throughout the house. Again, not dramatic quantities of drugs, just enough to anchor the broader case. The trials never really happened. Faced with wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, financial records, and seizures spread across multiple states, both brothers took plea deals. In 2008, Demetrius Flannery and Terry Flannery were each sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. 30 years meant something different in federal time. No parole, limited reductions, long stretches in high-security facilities. For men who had lived on movement, flights, clubs, and caravans, prison imposed stillness. Demetrius was eventually designated to USP Coleman II in Florida, a high-security penitentiary. Life inside followed a different economy: routine, reputation, restraint. Meech became known less for violence and more for influence. Someone people listened to, someone who understood timing even behind bars. Terry's experience unfolded differently. From the start, Terry maintained a distance from the mythology. Where Meech had embraced visibility, Terry had always preferred insulation. In prison, that difference mattered. He kept his head down, avoided infractions, and focused on time. When COVID-19 swept through federal facilities in 2020, it created a crack in the system no one had planned for. T was granted compassionate release after serving approximately 15 years, citing health concerns and vulnerability to the virus. Meech stayed inside because the judge had come to believe he still hadn't learned the lesson. Even in prison, he was continuing to project the image of a drug lord, still chasing visibility. The same mindset that once drove him on the streets hadn't disappeared. If people didn't know what he was doing, it wasn't worth doing.